A frightened girl, her face smeared with mud and rainwater, kneels on the asphalt beside an unconscious, too-still boy dressed in velvet and gold, realizing the ancient voice that answers his phone belongs to a being who rules the darkness she's always been afraid of. The unrelenting rain was Leora's only constant friend and shield on the streets, turning the pavement into a slick, mirroring black. She was a master of the invisible life, a flicker in the periphery, small and quick, living off of what others missed. Tonight, the cold was a biting enemy, sinking into her threadbare layers as she navigated the abandoned industrial section near the river. The few sickly orange streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to sway and shift like hungry ghosts. Leora, perpetually hungry and alert, was halfway to her secluded alcove when her foot snagged, sending her stumbling not over a discarded crate, but something impossibly soft. Catching herself on the wet wall, Leora turned back, her street instincts screaming at her to run. The object of her stumble was a boy, no older than 9 or 10, collapsed against a concrete pillar. His clothes were wrong, a child-sized king's ransom in burgundy velvet and gold embroidery, now soaked and ruined by the downpour. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost luminous, and his dark hair was pasted to his delicate, aristocratic face. He looked less like a runaway and more like a discarded porcelain doll. Leora's sharp gasp was silenced by a faint wrongness she felt in the air, a small patch of shadow that didn't belong, pulsing subtly on the boy's chest. It was a cold, deep black that seemed to drink the light, and her hand instinctively recoiled from it. Something is terribly wrong, she thought, her fear overridden by the desperate need to help a child more vulnerable than herself. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we bring these supernatural tales to life. Her trembling fingers searched the luxurious, soaked clothes until they located the source of the boy's anachronism, a sleek, modern smartphone. The screen, lit by the pressing of a button, displayed only one saved contact: father. Without a thought for the danger, Leora's thumb hit the call button. The line connected instantly, and the voice that answered was not merely human. It was deep, like the distant rumbling of the earth, perfectly controlled and impossibly ancient. "This isn't Kale," Leora managed, forcing her voice steady. "My name is Leora. I found a boy on the street. He's unconscious, near the old textile building. I think this is his emergency contact." The following silence was absolute, heavier than the rain, thick with immense, calculating power. "Is he breathing?" The man's voice, now colder than the street, cut through the tension. "Do not call anyone else. Do not move him. I am less than 5 minutes away. Stay with him and protect him." The line went dead. Leora's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. 5 minutes. The streetlights flickered again, and she suddenly understood she wasn't waiting for a father, she was waiting for a predator. The silence was broken not by an engine, but by a sound like a whisper of wind through a crypt. A long, black, impossibly silent car materialized at the curb. The door opened, and one figure emerged: Alistair Valen, the Vampire King. Tall, devastatingly elegant in his dark, embroidered coat, he moved with the liquid grace of a hunter. His gaze, fixed on his son, was a lethal crimson, glowing faintly in the gloom. He didn't look at Leora, only at the boy. "You said he was unconscious." His voice, the same one from the phone, was worse in person, a velvet-wrapped dagger. "The shadow on his chest, I couldn't touch it," Leora whispered, pointing to the pulsing darkness. Alistair's hand, regal and pale, shot out to touch his son. The moment his finger brushed the shadow, his ancient skin hissed and smoked. He recoiled with a sound of primal agony and rage. Leora, fueled by pure, desperate instinct, moved without thinking. She pressed her hand, smeared with mud and rainwater, directly onto the pulsing, dark curse. Nothing happened. No burn, no pain, just the cold of the boy's skin. I can touch it, she realized with terrifying clarity. Alistair's crimson gaze snapped to hers, a crack of absolute shock and dawning, lethal hope in his inhuman composure. You come with me, he commanded, lifting Kale effortlessly into his arms. This is not a request. You are now my protection. Leora looked at the boy, who had, in the moment his father arrived, squeezed her hand faintly. She looked at the car, at the king whose eyes promised death and power, and she thought of the cold, hungry life she was leaving. She was afraid, but she was no longer invisible. She climbed into the car, leaving the rain, her anonymity, and her old life behind forever. She had no idea that in protecting a vampire prince, she had just given herself a new, terrifying, and utterly necessary purpose. The long, silent car pulled away from the curb, gliding into the downpour. The door closed behind her with a soft, final thud that resonated deeper than thunder. Through the tinted windows, Leora watched her old life disappear, the flickering, sickly orange streetlights, the slick, familiar pavement, the cold, hungry existence she'd known, fading into the night like a dream she was just now waking from. She had no idea that she'd just crossed a threshold into a world where the night had crimson eyes and teeth, where ancient courts waged wars in shadow, and where a poor girl who was once invisible could accidentally become the most dangerous piece on a board she didn't even know existed. She had no idea that in protecting a vampire prince, Kale, she had just declared herself the only human capable of touching the unholy. And she had no idea that Alistair Valen, the vampire king himself, was sitting across from her in the darkness, staring at the human girl who had touched forbidden magic and lived, wondering what fate and what terrifying weapon had just delivered itself to his door. The ride from the wet, desolate street to Alistair Valen's fortress was a silent journey across a threshold Leora hadn't known existed. The black sedan, still gliding with impossible quiet, didn't drive toward a neighborhood or a mansion, it drove toward a mountain. Or rather, a structure carved from a mountain ancient, black granite that seemed to absorb the rainy night's last light. The air inside the car was thick with the scent of ozone and old, cold power. Alistair sat opposite her, cradling Kale, his crimson eyes never leaving his son's pale face. He hadn't spoken since his command, but the silence was more demanding than any shout. Leora, huddled in the corner, felt the absence of her fear now replaced by sheer, wide-eyed awe and creeping dread. She was no longer afraid of a man, she was afraid of a king. When the car finally stopped, it was within a courtyard sheltered by colossal archways, the sound of the rain outside instantly muffled and distant. Guards, impossibly tall and still, stood everywhere, their gazes like chips of ice. Leora was ushered through vast, echoing halls where every shadow felt inhabited and the very air smelled of dust, old velvet, and dried iron. The opulence was overwhelming, thick tapestries that might have been painted with blood and gold, marble floors that shone like black ice, and ceilings that soared into unseen darkness. But the wealth was cold, sterile, and hostile. As they passed, the few figures Leora saw, vampire nobles in archaic dress, paused their whispers and turned their pale, contemptuous faces toward her. Their expressions, a mixture of disdain and predatory curiosity, cut her far deeper than the street's cold. They didn't see a girl, they saw a piece of dirt brought into their immaculate palace, a mortal weakness in their perfect, immortal world. The Court of Night has a new pet, she could almost hear them think. Kale was carried into a lavish chamber, a place of silent, soft light and dark woods, where the only sound was the gentle, irregular beeping of imported monitoring equipment. Waiting there was a thin, ageless vampire with kind, tired eyes and impeccable clothes, Cashin, the court healer. Alistair placed Kale on the bed, and the king's facade of composure finally cracked, replaced by fierce, possessive worry. Cashin immediately examined Kale, and the faint, pulsing shadow on his chest. He worked quickly, but his movements were ancient and ritualistic, combining supernatural knowledge with modern technology. After a moment, he turned to Alistair, his tone grave. "It is shadow binding, my king," Cashin confirmed, his voice low and rich. "A powerful form of the old curse, designed to siphon the Draven vitality through the air. It is subtle, slow, and intended to draw out your strength until you are forced to make a catastrophic move. A tactic, undoubtedly, of House Sanguina." Alistair looked ready to unleash the fury of centuries, his jaw locked tight. "The cure, Cashin? Or the counteragent?" Cashin sighed, then turned his gaze to Leora, who stood clutching her wet coat. "The shadow is a form of negative energy. It must be met with raw, pure, positive vitality to stabilize. Your own touch, Alistair, is too saturated with millennia of darkness to counteract it. But hers—" He gestured toward Leora. "When she touched the fabric, she felt no pain. She possesses a unique, powerful strain of mortal vitality, an anti-magic, if you will. She acts as an anchor. When she is close, the shadow cannot draw power. It is neutralized." Alistair's crimson eyes, which had been burning with rage, narrowed into analytical points, locking onto Leora as if calculating her monetary worth. She ceased to be an anomaly and became a weapon. He dismissed Cashin with a wave of his hand, and the two were left alone with the unconscious boy. Alistair slowly stepped toward her, stopping only inches away. The sheer force of his presence was a physical weight. "You have a choice, mortal," Alistair said, his voice quiet, yet filling the massive room. "Stay here, in the Court of Night. You will have protection absolute, wealth beyond your comprehension, and safety from the wretched life you endured on the streets. You will be safe, Leora, provided you tend to Kale and keep this curse neutralized." The offer was everything the street child in her had ever dreamed of: food, warmth, safety. But Leora looked at Kale, whose small, pale hand had reached for her warmth, and then back at the king, who saw her as a tool. She swallowed her fear. "I will stay," Leora said, forcing her gaze steady. "But I set the condition, not you." Alistair raised one elegant, dark eyebrow, utterly unused to defiance. "A mortal girl sets a condition before her king?" "I stay only as long as Kale needs me," she repeated, her voice trembling but firm. "The moment Cashin says he is truly safe, or the moment Kale says he doesn't want me here, I leave. I will not be your shield or your pet, Alistair. I will be his helper. And you will respect my choice to leave when my job is done." Alistair studied her for a long moment, a chilling, cold smile slowly curving his perfect lips. The smile wasn't kind, it was calculating, appreciative. He realized he couldn't buy her with gold or shelter because she valued something far more powerful: loyalty and her own fierce independence. "Very well, Leora," the vampire king finally conceded, a subtle amusement in his voice. "I accept the condition. But understand this. When you are a guest in my house, your promise is my command. You are under the protection of the Draven line, and your presence here has now put a target on your back. Welcome to the Court of Night." The king was true to his word, though his definition of protection was clinical and absolute. Leora was immediately whisked away from the hostile glances of the court and given quarters that dwarfed the entirety of her old street refuge. The bed was too large, the blankets too soft, the silence too complete. The first night, she slept on the floor beside the window, unnerved by the sheer luxury and the unnaturally long shadows thrown by the ancient, silver candlesticks. Her personal retainer was a vampire warrior named Virus. He was solid, stoic, and moved with a terrifying economy of motion. Virus didn't speak unless addressed, and when he did, his voice was the rasp of a whetstone on steel. His primary directive, he informed her coldly, was not to offer comfort, but to keep her heart beating and her life force stable, as she was now King Alistair's most vital resource. He was her shadow, her guard, and soon, her reluctant mentor. Leora's days quickly fell into a rhythm centered around Kale's chamber. The boy remained mostly unconscious, the shadow curse on his chest subtly receding and returning, fighting a slow, invisible war. Her role was simple: proximity. She sat in a heavy, velvet chair pulled right beside his bed, her hand resting lightly on the expensive blankets near his arm, anchoring him against the encroaching darkness. But Leora was not content to simply sit. She started by talking to him. She didn't speak of the grand, cold court outside or the dangerous king. She spoke of her world. She told him whispered tales of surviving the market, the ingenious hiding spots she knew, the clever ways she bartered for food, and the one cherished library book she'd secretly kept, a collection of grand, ridiculous adventure stories. She began reading them to him in a low, earnest tone, tales of dragon slayers, forgotten queens, and simple heroes who won with cleverness rather than strength. She read for hours, filling the silence of the sick room with the warm, familiar sound of human story. The stories, meant to distract her, seemed to work on Kale as well. Sometimes, in the middle of a passage about a brave knight, his pale eyelids would flutter. More importantly, his hand, resting on the blanket, would sometimes reach out, his small, ice-cold fingers weakly squeezing hers when she paused. It was a faint but definitive response, a sign that the boy within the cursed shell was fighting and listening. Their bond deepened in this silent, shared space, a secret alliance formed over smuggled tales and fierce, protective touch. While her nights were spent anchoring Kale, her brief daylight hours were consumed by Virus's rigorous training. He didn't teach her how to fight, he taught her how to survive them. "The world is sharp, street child," Virus would intone, leading her through the maze of the fortress's hidden passages. "Be sharper. Learn the hierarchy. A simple baronet may kill you on a whim. The king's direct counsel will only kill you strategically. Know the difference." He taught her the names and sigils of the major houses, the subtle social cues of the undead, and their specific, ancient weaknesses, where to look for their true age, how to avoid giving offense to a being who lived 1,000 years, and, crucially, how to disappear within a crowd of vampires without making a sound. Leora, having survived on the indifference of the street, was a surprisingly quick study. She understood camouflage and strategy intimately. Her past life had trained her for this cold, dangerous court better than any academy. The ultimate test, however, always came from the king himself. Alistair Valen visited Kale every night, staying for a quiet hour of vigilant observation. But the king spent most of that time observing Leora. He didn't test her loyalty, he tested her resolve. One night, as Leora finished a chapter about a runaway princess finding a secret garden, Alistair spoke, his voice dry and challenging. "I have offered you wealth and freedom, Leora. I have offered you a carriage, a manor, and protection. Yet you chose to bind yourself to my son, a dying boy, and to this court, which loathes your existence. Why do you stay, Leora? You have your freedom to leave." Leora closed the book, placing it carefully on the bedside table. She looked not at the king's commanding height, but directly into his terrifying crimson eyes. "He asked me to stay, my king," she answered, her voice steady now, drawn from a deep well of street-hardened conviction. "When he was half dead on the street, he reached for me. When you came, he squeezed my hand. When someone asks for help and you promise to give it, you don't leave. That is my law." She paused, then delivered the final, sharp blow. "I keep my promises, Alistair. Something your court, perhaps, seems to have forgotten in their pursuit of power." Alistair did not rage. He did not punish. He merely gave that chilling, slow smile, realizing that the street child was not merely an anchor for the curse, but an anchor for an obsolete, powerful virtue he desperately needed, an unpurchasable, fiercely loyal soul. He knew then that she was far more dangerous than she appeared. Alistair Valen was a strategist, and Leora knew her presence in Kale's chamber was temporary. To solidify her role, and perhaps to gauge the extent of the Sanguina threat, the king decided Leora needed a public introduction. This was not a kindness, it was a deployment. The minor court gathering felt like entering a frozen garden of obsidian. Hundreds of years of history and hostility were compressed into one grand ballroom, lit by chandeliers that dripped cold light onto polished stone. Leora was dressed in the finest clothes Alistair's retainers could hastily assemble, but even the silk felt plain next to the iridescent robes and ancient jewels of the assembled vampire nobility. She was conspicuously mortal, conspicuously small, and conspicuously out of place. She felt every single pair of ancient eyes dissecting her, their silent judgment sharp and poisonous. Virus stood like a granite column 2 steps behind her, his stillness the only reassurance she possessed. The whispering began the moment she walked in. It wasn't loud, but in the echoing silence of the court, the word mortal was spat out like venom. Leora kept her gaze focused, remembering Virus's endless lessons on bearing. You are here by the king's will. Do not apologize for existing. The confrontation came swiftly, heralded by a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. A tall, impeccably dressed vampire with a smile as thin as a paper cut glided toward them. This was Lord Silvius, the emissary of House Sanguina, the very faction responsible for Kale's curse. Silvius ignored Virus entirely, his focus settling on Leora with condescending curiosity. "Ah, the little anchor," Silvius purred, his voice oil-smooth and carrying just loud enough for the surrounding nobles to hear. He bowed with mocking exaggeration. One must admire King Alistair's resourcefulness. To depend upon a mere mortal street urchin to save the Draven line. It speaks volumes of how far the mighty have fallen. The gathered nobles chuckled, a cold, brittle sound. Leora kept her face expressionless, clinging to the mantra Virus had drilled into her, never show fear to the Sanguina. Silvius stepped closer, his smile widening into something predatory. "Tell me, little bird," he murmured, reaching out his elegant hand. "Do you enjoy the fine tapestries? Or do you miss the smell of the street?" Before Leora could respond, his hand, cold and heavy, reached for her arm, intending to drag her closer for inspection, perhaps to test her resolve or provoke a reaction. Leora acted on instinct and training. Virus had taught her that even an immortal body had pressure points. As Silvius's fingers tightened on her skin, Leora subtly rotated her wrist just so, pressing a key point on his hand. The effect was immediate. Silvius hissed, jerking his hand back as if scalded, his face momentarily contorted in a flash of genuine, unexpected pain. The noise stopped. The brittle laughter died. The room went absolutely, terrifyingly silent. A mortal had wounded a high-ranking noble in the middle of the king's court. Alistair Valen, who had been observing from the far side of the room, moved. It was not a walk, it was a phenomenon. He was suddenly there, a towering presence of lethal coldness, positioned effortlessly between Leora and the stunned Lord Silvius. His crimson eyes were blazing, but his voice was dangerously quiet, resonating through the shocked silence like a struck bell. "You will remove yourself, Lord Silvius," Alistair commanded, his accent dropping into something ancient and feral. "And you will listen closely. Leora is under my protection. She is a guest of the Draven lineage, and her value is absolute. Any deliberate action against her, a slight, a threat, or a physical touch not sanctioned by me, ***, will be considered a declaration of war *** against the king himself." His warning wasn't aimed just at Silvius, but at every single noble in the room. He wasn't protecting a girl. He was protecting his vital resource, and he was drawing a line in the blood-soaked marble. The message was clear: touch her, and you touch my throne. Silvius, pale and shaken by the unexpected confrontation, bowed stiffly and retreated, his eyes promising retribution. As Alistair turned away from the crowd, his face softened slightly, recognizing Leora's silent defiance. He hadn't punished her for her action. He'd rewarded her with public, terrifying validation. Leora understood the equation perfectly. She was a tool, but an effective, sharp one, and that's why the king protected her. Back in the solitude of Kale's chamber later that night, Leora recounted the evening to the still recuperating boy, simplifying the danger but focusing on the drama. She was still humming with adrenaline when she finished. Kale, whose breathing had been shallow, gave a faint smile. His pale fingers sought hers and squeezed, stronger this time. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thin but clear for the first time. "You were brave." It wasn't the king's terrifying command, the opulence, or the promised safety that settled Leora's heart. It was the simple, sincere recognition from the boy she was risking everything for. In the cold, cruel halls of the Vampire King, Kale's quiet gratitude was the only reward that mattered. The slow, agonizing recovery of Kale demanded constant vigilance from Leora, but it also necessitated Cassion's constant observation. The court healer spent hours in the chamber, running ancient spells and modern diagnostics, trying to chart the subtle dance between the shadow curse and the human girl acting as its counteragent. One crisp, silent night, a sense of electric anticipation filled the room. Cassion, hovering over Kale's bed, finally looked up, his tired eyes wide with a combination of disbelief and dawning realization. Alistair, seated in the corner, straightened instantly, his inhuman stillness breaking. "The binding, it's not just static," Cassion breathed, gesturing to the faint, black sigil on Kale's chest. "It's shrinking. It's actively weakening." Alistair crossed the room in 2 soundless strides. "Explain, Cassion. What is diminishing it?" "Her presence, my king," the healer said, turning to Leora with a look of profound, almost religious awe. "It's not merely that the curse cannot feed from Kale while she is here. Her raw, pure life force, her mortality, unstained by vampiric shadow, is creating an environment that is actively hostile to the curse's very existence. Think of her not as a battery, but as an anti-magic shield. The curse is literally being suffocated by her vitality." Leora watched the exchange, feeling a strange mix of terror and grim pride. She was no longer just a helper. She was a genuine, existential threat to House Sanguina's plans. Cassion concluded with a stark statement: "The Sanguina cannot touch Kale while she is near him. She is the key to their defeat." Alistair Valen didn't look at Leora with gratitude or warmth. He looked at her with the calculating intensity of a general who has just been handed the perfect, rarest weapon. His mind was already miles away, charting strategies. Later that same night, while Leora was fetching a fresh cup of water for Kale's slowly reviving throat, she paused near the heavy, sculpted doorway. She heard the king speaking in low, urgent tones to Virus, who was standing guard outside. Cassion's findings change everything. Alistair's voice was sharp, purely strategic. "Sanguina knows her value now. They know they must either kill her or separate her from Kale immediately. She is no longer just protection. She is the weapon that will destroy the curse entirely." Leora pressed herself against the cold marble wall, listening. "We must use her, Virus, but we must first ensure her absolute safety," Alistair continued. "I will not risk the key. I will finalize the plan to draw Sanguina into the open using Kale, but Leora must be secured. She is a shield. She will be kept safe, no matter her protest. We will move her to the deep fortress vault tomorrow morning. She is a tool that will not be risked." A cold knot of anger tightened in Leora's chest, eclipsing her fear. A tool. A shield. Secured. Vault. They were talking about her as if she were an object, a priceless artifact to be stored until needed. She pushed off the wall and strode back into the room, her small figure radiating a furious defiance that seemed to crack the king's cold composure. "I overheard you," Leora announced, not bothering with honorifics or polite silence. Her voice was taut with adrenaline. Alistair fixed his gaze on her, his expression hardening. "You should not be eavesdropping, girl. It is dangerous. You shouldn't be planning to lock me up like a prized sword. Leora shot back, stepping closer to the massive king. You're going to use Kale as bait, and you're going to put me in a vault because you're afraid of losing your weapon. Alistair rose to his full, towering height, a silent, terrifying warning of his immense power. You will speak with respect. My decision is final. Your safety is paramount to the survival of the Draven lineage. My safety? Leora scoffed, planting her hands on her hips. My safety is what keeps Kale alive, yes. But I'm not a shield, Alistair. I'm a person. I chose to stay because Kale asked me to, not because you commanded me. And you can't lock up a person and expect them to fight for you. You can't put me in a cage and expect me to care about your throne. She pointed to Kale, sleeping peacefully thanks to her presence. I risked my life on the street every day, and I wasn't afraid. But I am afraid of losing the only connection I've made in this cold, empty castle. You can take my freedom, Alistair, but you will lose my loyalty the second you treat me like a piece of glass you need to store in the dark. The tension in the room was suffocating. Alistair stared down at the small, furious girl. He had faced armies and ancient blood feuds, but this raw, unyielding human honesty, this challenge to his absolute authority rooted in a simple promise, was something he hadn't encountered in centuries. He saw not a street urchin, but the same fierce, unpurchasable loyalty that had saved his son in the alley. It complicated his strategy, but it did not change his objective. He had to protect his weapon, even from itself. Go to bed, Leora, Alistair finally said, his voice dangerously soft. The vault is prepared. We will discuss this in the morning. The threat of the vault hung over Leora, a constant pressure more suffocating than the court's disdain. She knew Alistair would make good on his plan to secure his shield, and she was desperately searching for a way to appeal to him without surrendering her self-respect. Her only solace was Kale, who, thanks to her continuous proximity, was stronger now, able to sit up weakly and listen to her stories. The attack came not from the shadows, but from the light, disguised as mundane routine. It was midday, a rare time of quiet in the fortress. Alistair was attending a strategic council, Virus was momentarily relieved by a junior guard, and Leora was tidying Kale's chamber, humming a street tune she hadn't realized she remembered. 2 serving staff, pale and silent, entered the room bearing a tray of fresh water and exotic fruits. Leora barely noticed them. The court staff were always ghosts. But as one of the servants placed the tray down, the other moved with impossible, silent speed. The shift was instantaneous, the mask of servitude dropping to reveal the honed focus of a killer. A thin, silver blade, polished to razor sharpness, flashed toward Leora's side. Leora's street instincts, sharpened by Virus's endless drills, kicked in faster than her fear. She didn't scream or freeze, she dropped. Rolling away from the blow, she heard the whoosh of air where her body had been a second before. The chamber instantly transformed into a battlefield. The 2 agents, revealed now as Sanguina assassins, moved to flank her. Leora, small and quick, dodged the second strike by scrambling behind a heavy, antique wardrobe, her mind racing through Virus's lessons. Don't fight strength with strength. Use your environment. She launched a heavy, bronze clock from atop the wardrobe, sending it crashing into the face of the nearest attacker, buying herself a crucial second. She spun toward the door, realizing her mistake. The junior guard was already neutralized, lying silently in the hall. She was cornered, with Kale in the bed behind her, utterly vulnerable. The 2 assassins advanced, their cold eyes gleaming. They didn't use their full speed, playing with her, knowing she couldn't escape. Leora braced herself, looking wildly for anything, a heavy book, a lamp, anything that could act as a weapon. Just as the lead assassin lunged, preparing the final, decisive blow, a sound ripped through the chamber, not a human cry, but a raw, desperate roar of protective fury. A shockwave of shadow power exploded from the bed. It was black, cold, and blindingly potent, a pure, unformed manifestation of Draven darkness. The air cracked, and the waves slammed into the Sanguina agents, sending them flying back against the opposite wall with sickening force. The two attackers slid to the floor, stunned, momentarily incapacitated, their mission aborted by a force they hadn't planned for. Leora stared speechless at the epicenter of the blast. Kale was sitting bolt upright in the center of the bed, his small chest heaving violently, his pale eyes wide and blazing with a crimson fire that mirrored his father's. The pulsing shadow curse on his skin had momentarily vanished, displaced by the terrifying, raw power he had just unleashed. He was a small, fragile shield, shaking with the massive effort that nearly killed him, but his focus was absolute, fixed on Leora. "You are not going anywhere," Kale gasped, the words ragged and weak, but charged with fierce, selfless command. "You stay." The effort was too much. The crimson light faded from his eyes, the raw shadow power receded, and the boy instantly collapsed back onto the pillows, falling into a deeper, more dangerous unconsciousness. The residual shadow sigil on his chest reappeared, pulsing darkly, hungrier now than before. Leora rushed to his side, abandoning all thought of the assassins. She pushed her hand against his pale, clammy cheek, desperately seeking a response. A moment later, the true king arrived. The door burst inward, splintered by the sheer force of Alistair Valen's speed and fury. He surveyed the scene, two incapacitated Sanguina agents, the chamber walls subtly scorched by shadow magic, and Leora kneeling beside the still, small form of Kale. Alistair didn't spare a glance for the agents. His focus was entirely on his son. He knelt, checking Kale's pulse with a gentleness that belied his lethal rage. "Cashin now," Alistair roared, his voice shaking the heavy curtains. To Virus, who had materialized instantly in the doorway, he commanded, his voice cold as the grave, "Total lockdown. Every member of the serving staff, every minor noble, interrogate. No one moves. This fortress is a crypt until I find the source." Leora cradled Kale's head, whispering reassurance to the boy who couldn't hear her. Her fear was gone, replaced by a profound, piercing certainty. Kale's act wasn't born of strategy or duty, it was pure, unadulterated protectiveness. He had risked death, not because she was a tool, but because she was his. In the midst of the cold darkness of the ancient power and lethal court, this selfless, fierce act of connection was the single most vital, real thing Leora had ever witnessed. She was ready to risk anything for a boy who would risk his own life just to keep her near. The fortress, true to Alistair's command, was now a sealed vault, the atmosphere tense and claustrophobic. The immediate threat of the Sanguina agents had been neutralized, but Kale was in a fragile state, his energy depleted by the burst of shadow power. Leora returned to her post, anchoring him once more, her hand fiercely gripping his, whispering promises of adventure to rally his strength. Alistair's anger was cold and monumental. He had spent days tearing the fortress apart, ensuring every shadow and every servant was checked for allegiance to House Sanguina. He had redoubled Leora's security, now entrusting her to a small, unblinking cadre of his oldest, most trusted guard, with Virus always within arm's reach. But his surveillance of Leora herself was the most intense of all. He was determined to protect his key, even if it meant shackling her. Leora was reading Kale one of the few books allowed in the chamber, a worn volume of poetry she'd found in the opulent library. She paused to turn a page, her concentration broken by a subtle, alien feeling. A thin, folded piece of parchment had been meticulously tucked between the pages, a material and scent utterly foreign to the sterile chamber. It was a risk, a penetration of the king's absolute lockdown, proving Sanguina's reach was wider than Alistair realized. She unfolded the note quickly, concealing it beneath the volume. The message was brief, brutally efficient and designed to hit her hardest. We took the woman who taught you to read. Meet us at the old docks alone, and the boy lives. Tell the king and she dies. You are our anchor now. Leora's heart seized. The woman. Old Mrs. Alara. She had run the secret, tiny street school in the derelict church basement, risking everything to teach Leora and others how to read and write. Alara was Leora's only true connection to kindness and caring in her old life, the closest thing she had to a mother, a mentor, and a light in the cold. Alara was her emotional anchor, the one person whose simple goodness confirmed Leora wasn't entirely alone. The matriarch Vespera hadn't just studied the Draven court, she had studied Leora, the mortal asset. She had found Leora's single point of vulnerability. Leora shoved the note into the deepest recess of her pocket, her breath shallow. But in the king's court, a moment of unusual stillness or a sudden movement could be a fatal error. Alistair, seated at a nearby desk studying ancient military maps, glanced up instantly, his crimson eyes registering the flicker of panic on her face. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice dropping in temperature. Leora shook her head too quickly. "Nothing. Just, the poetry is sad." Alistair didn't move, but the air around him charged with suspicion. Leora knew that to lie was to invite scrutiny. To hide was to fail. She fumbled, instinctively reaching for her pocket. It was the wrong move. Alistair was upon her in a heartbeat, moving faster than the eye could follow. His long, cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, easily disarming her, and he pulled the crumpled note from her pocket. He read the missive, his marble-pale features remaining impassive, but the temperature in the chamber plummeted, coating the furniture in invisible frost. He finished reading, then slowly released her wrist. "An obvious trap," he stated, his tone flat, devoid of emotion, yet radiating immense, controlled power. "They have Alara," Leora whispered, her voice raw with grief. Alistair crumpled the note into a small ball of paper dust and let it fall to the floor. His response was immediately, brutally rational. "She is an unacceptable cost, Leora. Sanguina is baiting a trap designed to achieve one goal, to separate you from Kale, removing the anti-magic shield so they can finish the curse." He looked at Kale, then back at Leora, his gaze colder than the winter night she'd found them in. "You will not go, Leora. Kale is the priority. Your mentor is unfortunate collateral damage in a political war. I cannot risk the balance of the court for one insignificant mortal woman." Leora stared at him, recognizing the unbridgeable abyss that separated his ancient, cold strategy from her simple, fierce morality. He saw a chess piece, she saw a debt of love. He saw collateral damage, she saw her only light. "You don't understand," she whispered, her hands shaking, tears finally blurring her vision. She wasn't just a mentor. She was my anchor. My only light before Kale. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to act anyway. That choice. I owe it to her. She met his gaze, the determination settling into her heart, hard and clear. "You measure her life against your throne. I measure it against my soul. I will go." Alistair's fury finally broke the surface, manifesting not in a shout, but a terrifying, controlled growl. "You will not disobey me. You are confined to this room. You are not a warrior, you are an asset. You have been ordered to remain with Kale. If you step outside this chamber, you will be defying the king, and the consequence will be severe." He signaled to Virus, who instantly moved to the doorway. Before Leora could argue, Alistair gave the final, absolute command. "Lock her in, Virus. Ensure she cannot leave. Her loyalty is commendable, but her survival is necessary. She will not risk the Draven line for a forgotten street woman." The heavy, carved doors swung shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing, and the latch mechanism clicked home, silencing Leora's protests. She was locked inside her gilded cage, trapped by the very king she was saving. But as she sank onto the cold stone floor, Her heart was already committed. She would not let Alara die. She would keep her promises. She was going to the docks. The confinement lasted exactly 73 minutes. Leora paced her opulent prison, the click of the lock mocking her defiance. She was trapped by the king's superior logic and strength, but Alistair had made one fatal miscalculation. He had treated her like a treasure, but he had trained her like a survivor. He had forced her to learn the court's weaknesses, and Leora intended to use every lesson. She studied the heavy velvet drapes, the thick rugs, and the placement of the single, small ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was impossibly high, but Leora, the street acrobat, saw only a challenge. The key wasn't brute force, it was knowledge. She knew the fortress, thanks to Virus's grueling training sessions. She knew the secret, narrow servant passages tucked behind the kitchens and ancient armories, corridors so low and dark that only the servants and the small, invisible street child could navigate them easily. More critically, she knew the guard rotation. Virus had meticulously drilled her on the shift changes, the 2-minute window when the most vigilant guards rotated posts near the western gate. Using a heavy, antique silver shoehorn, a detail the king had overlooked in his rush to secure her, Leora slowly, painstakingly worked loose the ornamental bracket holding the heaviest tapestry near the window. It took 30 minutes of frantic, silent effort. The bracket gave way with a muffled thud. She used the metal rod as a makeshift climbing hook, leveraging her small, wiry strength against the window frame. Up she went, silent as a ghost, until she reached the ventilation grate. The grate was too small for anyone but her. She squeezed through, dropping into the cold, silent depths of the ancient walls. Moving through the servants' passages felt like slipping back into her old skin. The dark, dusty, anonymous spaces were familiar and comforting. She traversed the labyrinthian routes, avoiding the main halls and the vigilant, enhanced senses of the vampire guards. She held her breath, ignoring the stinging scrapes on her knees and hands. She emerged near the western wall, precisely at the beginning of the rotation window. The enormous outer door was sealed, but Virus had once pointed out a flaw in the king's ancient architecture, a rarely used maintenance hatch, hidden by ivy. It was locked with a sophisticated mechanism, but Leora knew locks. On the streets, survival meant mastery over simple bolts and tumblers. The king's ancient mechanisms, though complex, were predictable. Using a thin piece of metal filigree she had stripped from a decorative frame in Kale's room, she worked the tumblers, her concentration absolute. The clock was ticking, the guard rotation nearly complete. Click. The small hatch opened just enough for her to squeeze through, depositing her onto the cold, wet earth outside the fortress walls. She ran, not toward the city center, but toward the river, toward the derelict, forgotten world she had come from. The docks were miles away, and Leora ran through the biting cold of the pre-dawn hours, fueled entirely by adrenaline and the fierce conviction that she was doing the right thing. When she reached the industrial waterfront, the atmosphere was suffocating, the smell of stagnant water, decay, and old rust. The meeting spot was a massive, abandoned warehouse, its windows broken like jagged teeth. She pushed open the heavy, creaking door and stepped inside. The warehouse was cavernous, smelling of salt and wet concrete. A single, weak bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light on the center of the vast floor. And there they were, Matriarch Vespera of House Sanguina, draped in robes of deep crimson, her face aristocratic and cruel, radiating an icy sense of victory. She stood flanked by 6 elite, stone-faced Sanguina guards, their weapons sheathed but ready. And tied to a stack of moldy crates, gagged and struggling, was Mrs. Alara. Vespera smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips. The little shield comes to her death, the matriarch purred, her voice like grinding silk. I admit, Alistair's attachment to his key was predictable, but your own loyalty, little one? That is a magnificent foolishness. She gestured to the empty warehouse. You brought yourself to the ambush. And you came alone. Tell me, did the great king watch you defy him and run? Leora stopped 10 feet away, forcing her shaking legs to hold steady. She looked at Vespera, then at Alara, whose terrified eyes pleaded for her to run. No, Leora said, her voice small but clear, echoing in the vast space. You brought your defeat, matriarch. Vespera laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that rang unnervingly in the silence. Such bravery. You think your defiance matters? You are a pinprick against the Draven's ancient power. You thought Alistair was the threat, Leora continued, ignoring the mockery, forcing her strategy into the open. You thought he was the one who was going to walk through that door. But you came for the one person in his court, the only person who is willing to die for what is right. She took 2 steps closer, pointing directly at her bound mentor, then back at herself. You won't kill either of us yet. You need Alara for leverage against me. You need me to counter the curse on Kale. Without me, Kale dies and you get a dead heir, not the Draven surrender you crave. You are strategically pinned. You have the shield in your hands, but you can't use it and you can't destroy it. Vespera's smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation. The small mortal child was talking like a tactician, using the Sanguina's own strategy against them. Leora hadn't just walked into the trap, she had deliberately stalled the execution. She had bought time, using her own existence as a political tool. The trap was sprung, but the execution was on hold. The immense tension was palpable, coiled and ready to snap. Clever girl, Vespera hissed, her fingers flexing into sharp claws. But you're still mortal, and I am growing tired of this waiting game. Before the king arrives to retrieve his toy, I will simply separate your head from your tactical mind. Vespera moved, not with the blur of vampire speed, but with the arrogant, calculated swiftness of a predator playing with its prey. She lunged for Leora. Vespera's lunge was the end of the game. Her face was a mask of cold triumph, her clawed fingers aimed for Leora's throat. Leora braced, knowing her clever stall was over, preparing to fight dirty, but utterly unable to stop the matriarch's immortal speed. Then, the world shattered. The single, sickly yellow bulb overhead exploded, plunging the cavernous warehouse into absolute darkness. It wasn't a power outage. The light didn't just fail, it was crushed. Simultaneously, a crushing pressure descended upon the room, a palpable force that felt like the weight of 10,000 years. The air became agonizingly cold, sharp with the ozone of ancient, unbound power. The Sanguina guards, elite warriors though they were, gasped, dropping to their knees, paralyzed by the sheer, devastating authority that had just entered the space. A growl, low and resonant, vibrated through the structure, a sound that bypassed the ears and rattled the soul. You will not touch her. Alistair Valen didn't walk in, he manifested. He stood silhouetted in the broken doorway, taller and more terrible than Leora had ever seen him, a vortex of lethal, absolute shadow. His crimson eyes were not merely glowing, they were twin novas of blinding, uncontrolled fury, and the air around him pulsed with visible, dark energy. Vespera, the only one who dared to remain standing, retreated a step, her bravado momentarily replaced by genuine dread. Alistair, she hissed, recovering quickly. You break your own protocol. You risk leaving the air. Silence. Alistair cut her off, the sound like 1,000 razor blades scratching stone. He hadn't brought a car or guards or subtlety. He had come with pure, overwhelming, unmasked power. And he hadn't looked at Kale since he read the note. He was here for Leora. He moved, and the distance between himself, Vespera, and Leora vanished. He positioned himself in front of Leora, a wall of terrible, elegant rage, protecting the defiance he had just locked away. You brought her here to force my hand, Vespera, Alistair said, his voice quiet now, but steeped in absolute menace. You assumed I would prioritize the continuity of the Draven lineage, my throne, over a mortal life. Vespera scoffed. Is that not the function of a king? Is she not mere collateral? Alistair raised his hand, the gesture stopping the matriarch's breathing. He confessed his true fear, not to Leora, but to his ancient rival, a devastating admission stripped bare by desperation and rage. I was not afraid of losing Cale's life, Alistair growled, his voice thick with a terrifying realization. The curse would kill him slowly, and I could fight it. I was not afraid of losing my throne. I have ruled for too long to be toppled by a cheap parlor trick. No. His crimson gaze burned into Vespera, exposing the core of his ancient heart. I was afraid of losing the only thing that proves he is more than just my heir, his ability to inspire fierce, unconditional loyalty. His ability to connect with a soul so pure, she would defy me, defy death, and choose righteousness over survival. This girl, he swept his hand toward Leora, is the only living thing that proves my son is capable of true, selfless love, a strength you, Vespera, will never understand. He had followed her not because she was a tool, but because, for the first time in centuries, he was truly afraid of losing a member of his family. The realization was a fatal flaw in Vespera's strategy. She had not only failed to kill the king's weapon, she had exposed the king's most profound, recent vulnerability. The ensuing battle was not a skirmish, it was an annihilation. Alistair gave Vespera no quarter, no time to utilize her sanguina guards. He moved with the blinding power of a force of nature, his shadow magic manifesting as pure, destructive energy. The matriarch and her elite guard were not fought, they were simply erased. The warehouse groaned under the onslaught, the ancient structure fracturing. Alistair's fury was terrifying. He reduced the sanguina guards to ash and used the full, devastating weight of the Draven power to crush Vespera's very essence. The matriarch, the embodiment of cold ambition, met her end not with a grand duel, but with a primal, terrified scream as the king's unchecked power consumed her. When the deafening silence returned, the warehouse was a ruin, lit only by the cold, faint glow of Alistair's fading crimson eyes. He was standing over the ashes of his enemy, utterly spent, yet radiating absolute, decisive victory. He turned, finding Leora kneeling beside the bound Alara, cutting the ropes with a shard of glass. He didn't offer a lecture on disobedience. Instead, he simply knelt, his towering frame folding down to her small level. "Leora," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and the lingering edge of his terrible power. He reached out and touched her cheek, the gesture surprisingly gentle. "I was wrong. I apologize for calling her collateral damage. And I apologize for locking you in." He had risked his power, his protocol, and his composure. The king had been defeated, not by his enemy, but by the fierce loyalty of the girl he had tried to cage. And he had chosen to follow that loyalty into the jaws of a trap. Leora had forced him to confront the true meaning of power, protection, and the strength of a mortal's simple, fierce choice. The king's retribution was swift and final. Vespera's defeat in the derelict warehouse sent a shockwave through the entire court of night. When Alistair returned, carrying Leora and followed by a still-shaken, but safe Alara, the entire fortress fell into a reverent, terrified silence. The threat was neutralized, the Sanguina network shattered, and the true cost of attacking the Draven line had been paid in blood and ash. Mrs. Alara, having received the best mortal care the fortress could offer, was safely escorted out of the city with enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of her long life. A parting gift from the king who had been taught a difficult lesson about the value of human connection. Days later, with Cale finally out of danger, the shadow-binding curse fully receding under the continuous presence of Leora's anti-magic and the absence of the Sanguina's influence, Alistair convened the highest echelon of his court. This was not a celebration, it was a reckoning. Leora, freshly bathed and dressed in simple but elegant clothes, stood beside Virus in the vast, echoing throne room. She was small, but the aura of the king's protection made her the most important person there. Every vampire noble, pale, beautiful, and calculating, was present, eager to hear how the king would handle the twin issues of Sanguina's failure and Leora's blatant disobedience. Alistair sat on his obsidian throne, radiating cold authority. He began by systematically detailing the treason of House Sanguina and the fate of Vespera. When the final silence descended, he shifted his focus, his terrible crimson eyes sweeping the room until they settled on Leora. "Before us stands Leora," Alistair announced, his voice cutting through the stillness. "A mortal who defied my absolute command. She violated the lockdown, abandoned her post, and risked the Draven heir to run into an obvious trap. By the laws of this court, her actions constitute treason, and the punishment should be execution." A wave of suppressed satisfaction rippled through the noble ranks. Leora held her breath, prepared for the punishment, knowing she still wouldn't regret her choice. But Alistair did not condemn her. He straightened on his throne, his expression shifting to one of profound, cold conviction. "But I have learned a truth centuries of power blinded me to," he declared. Her defiance was not treason. It was a demonstration of a power stronger than my own. He looked directly at the stunned court. "Her loyalty proved stronger than my command. Her compassion saved my son and exposed our enemy's final, desperate attempt to wound us where we thought we were strongest." He stood, slowly descending the steps of the throne, his eyes never leaving Leora. "She is not a shield," he proclaimed. "She is not a servant. She is a reminder that value does not come from age or power, or the darkness of ancient blood, but from courage, the choice to keep a promise, even when facing death." When he reached Leora, he did something no one in the court had ever seen. He reached out, not to touch, but to envelop. Alistair Valen, the ancient and terrifying vampire king, pulled the small, brave street girl into a fierce, protective embrace. It was a kingly, absolute gesture that declared ownership and fierce devotion, silencing any remaining murmur of dissent. He released her and stepped back, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The moment of reckoning was over. The moment of choice had arrived. "Leora," Alistair said, his voice softer now, entirely focused on her. "You have fulfilled your obligation. Kale is stable. Sanguina is destroyed. Your mentor is safe. I will keep my word. You are free to go. A life of safety and generous wealth awaits you, far from the shadows of this court." Then, a sound Leora had not heard properly in weeks came from behind them. Kale, dressed in fresh velvet robes, walked unsteadily to his father's side. He was pale but alert, the shadow sigil on his chest gone entirely. Kale looked at Leora, his young eyes earnest and filled with a hope that seemed to defy the darkness of his world. "Please stay, Leora," he whispered, reaching out his small hand. "I don't want to be alone again." Leora looked from the vampire king, whose expression was a perfect balance of terrifying power and fierce, protective hope, to the boy whose heart she had anchored. She thought of her old life, the cold, the fear, the endless anonymity. She thought of the warmth of the stories, the thrill of the chase, and the power she had found in her own loyalty. She reached out and took Kale's hand, her gaze settling back on Alistair. "Here," she said, her voice clear and strong in the massive throne room. "You see me. You see all of me, the strength and the fear. And you let me protect the person I care about most." A genuine smile touched her lips. "I choose to stay." Alistair's face transformed, a profound, unreadable emotion crossing his features before settling back into regal command. He reached into his coat and produced a small, silver locket, ancient and simple, engraved with the subtle, looping sigil of the Draven lineage. He leaned down and carefully placed the chain around Leora's neck. "Welcome home, Leora. Welcome to the Draven family." He stood tall, facing his shocked court, and delivered his final, unequivocal decree. "She is not a guest, a servant, or a shield. Henceforth, she is Kale's daughter of the court. She is family." Her blood is mortal, but her spirit is of the Draven line. Any threat to her, any slight against her, or any deliberate action against her safety is a declaration of war against the king himself. Understood. The court bowed low, their silence now one of absolute understanding. Leora, the forgotten street child, had found her place, her purpose, and her family, standing in the heart of the darkness, forever protected by the unconditional strength of her simple, fierce loyalty. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So, do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next.